The lie was a second skin, one Kaela had worn for 5 years. It was woven from the scent of chamomile soap, the practiced slump of her shoulders, and the carefully averted gaze she offered to anyone who held her stare for too long. In the human city of Northgate, she was just Kaela, the quiet waitress at a 24-hour diner who was saving up for a community college course she would never take. She was breakable, forgettable, human. It was a meticulous, exhausting performance, but it was the only thing keeping her alive. Because Kaela was not human. She was a shadow weaver, a rare and reviled shifter subspecies with the ability to manipulate darkness and suppress her own scent, a talent that made her an abomination to some, and a priceless weapon to others. The one she was hiding from fell into the latter category. Tonight, the lie was wearing thin. The diner was quiet, the air thick with the smell of stale coffee and fried onions. Kaela was wiping down the sticky vinyl countertop when the bell above the door chimed, admitting a blast of cold night air and a presence that sucked all the warmth from the room. He didn't walk in so much as consume the space. He was tall, brutally so, with shoulders that strained the seams of his tailored black jacket. His hair was the color of a moonless night, and his face was all hard angles and unforgiving planes, saved from pure cruelty by a mouth that hinted at a savage sensuality. But it was his eyes that stopped her heart, the color of molten silver. They radiated a power so absolute it was a physical force. Kaela knew what he was. No human carried themselves with that level of predatory grace, that aura of total, undisputed command. He was a wolf shifter, an alpha. And from the way the two massive men flanking him deferred with their entire posture, he was the alpha of this territory. Her training, her survival instincts screamed at her. Head down, scent blank, be nothing. She forced her shoulders to slump, her eyes to drop to the grimy floor. But it was too late. He had already seen her. The moment his silver eyes landed on her, a jolt, hot and absolute, shot through Kaela's soul. It had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with a deafening, terrifying recognition. It was a phantom string that had connected their souls across time and space, suddenly pulled taut, vibrating with a force that made her gasp. Deep within her, the shadows she kept so tightly coiled stirred with a violent, possessive hunger. The word wasn't a thought. It was a brand, seared onto her very essence. Across the room, Alpha Ryker froze mid-stride. His wolf, a beast of ice and iron he had controlled with absolute dominion for a century, rose up and howled a single triumphant word inside his skull. He scanned the room, his senses flaring, searching for the source, the divine scent that should have accompanied such a bond. His silver gaze landed on the frail-looking waitress cowering by the counter. She was small, dressed in a hideous polyester uniform, and smelled of nothing. A void where a soul signature should be. She smelled human. Disbelief warred with the undeniable, cataclysmic pull in his soul. It was impossible. An insult. The fates could not have been so cruel as to shackle him, the alpha of the Black Moon pack, to a fragile, scentless human. He stalked toward her, his two enforcers staying by the door. He stopped directly in front of the counter, towering over her, his shadow swallowing her whole. He inhaled deeply, searching for any trace of a shifter's essence, any hint of a wolf. Nothing. Just the cloying, artificial scent of herbs. "What is your name?" he demanded. His voice a low, gravelly rumble that vibrated through the floor and up Kaela's spine. It was a voice used to absolute obedience. "Kaela," she whispered, her voice trembling, a performance that was now terrifyingly real. His eyes narrowed, sweeping over her with a dangerous scrutiny. His wolf was preening, ecstatic, urging him to claim what was his. But Ryker, the alpha, was filled with a cold, suspicious rage. This was wrong. Trick. Lie. And he would tear the truth from this little human, one way or another. Chapter 2. The Alpha's Paradox. From Ryker's perspective, the world had tilted on its axis. One moment, he was entering a neutral territory diner for a clandestine meeting. The next, his soul had been hijacked. The mate bond was not a myth or a gentle pull. It was a hostile takeover. A violent, elemental force that had rewired every circuit in his body to focus on the trembling human girl behind the counter. His wolf was a riot of triumph and confusion. "'Tis ours. Mull. Fragile. Protect. Claim." The instincts were overwhelming. A savage chorus that Ryker had to physically fight to suppress. He was an alpha of logic and control. He did not bow to instinct. But this was a paradox he couldn't solve. The bond screamed mate with the force of a supernova, yet all his senses screamed human. He could smell the faint, nervous sweat on her skin, the chemical scent of the cleaner she'd used on the counter, the artificial chamomile that clung to her like a shroud. There was no undercurrent of pine or earth or rain, nothing of the wolf. It was like looking at a flawless diamond and being told it was glass. "Look at me," he commanded, his voice harsher than he intended. Slowly, hesitantly, she lifted her head. Her eyes were the color of a stormy sea, wide and full of a carefully manufactured fear. He saw the faint, dark circles beneath them, the paleness of her skin. She looked like a strong wind could snap her in two. The sight sent a wave of protective fury through him so intense it almost buckled his knees. He wanted to wrap her in his coat, take her back to his fortress of Eden, and stand guard over her for 1,000 years. The urge was so feral, so unlike him, that it infuriated him. "You're trespassing," he stated, testing her. Northgate was a human city, but it was bordered on all sides by his territory. Any shifter passing through knew to pay their respects, to announce their presence. A lone, unaffiliated human wouldn't know or care. She flinched just as he expected. I didn't know," she stammered. "I just work here. I live a few blocks away." Her performance was perfect. Too perfect. A human would be terrified but also confused, indignant. Her fear felt like a well-worn coat she could slip on at a moment's notice. His eyes narrowed. "Who is she?" "Finn," Ryker said without turning, his voice low. One of his enforcers, a hulking man with a calm demeanor, stepped forward. "Alpha, our meeting is postponed. Take bail and sweep the perimeter. I want to know everything. Who she is, where she came from, how long she's been here. I want to know what she ate for breakfast." His voice was a low growl of absolute command. "No one speaks to her but me." "Alpha," Finn acknowledged, his expression unreadable as he and the other enforcer silently exited the diner, leaving the bell to chime in the oppressive silence. Ryker turned his full attention back to Kaela. He leaned forward, placing his hands flat on the counter, effectively caging her in. The scent of him, ozone after a lightning strike, ancient pine and cold winter air, was a physical assault. It was the scent of power, of dominance. Kaela felt her carefully constructed walls begin to crack, her own suppressed instincts wanting to rise up and answer his challenge. "I don't believe you," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerously soft tone. "This bond, it doesn't lie. But you do. Your very presence here is a lie." He watched her, his silver eyes searching for the slightest crack in her facade. He was the Alpha. His word was law, his senses infallible. But this girl, this mate, was an equation he couldn't solve. She was a paradox of weakness and power, of truth and deception. And the wolf inside him didn't care about the answer. It only cared about the claim. The Alpha, however, needed the truth. And he would have it, even if he had to shatter her fragile human world to get it. Chapter 3. A Cage of Glass. The diner, once a mundane workplace, had transformed into an interrogation room. Ryker didn't raise his voice or threaten her physically. He didn't have to. His sheer presence was a weapon. His focused, predatory attention a form of slow, suffocating pressure. He dismissed the diner's owner with a single glacial stare and a handful of cash that ensured their privacy for the rest of the night. Kaela's mind was racing. Every survival instinct screamed at her to maintain the act, but it was becoming almost impossible. Being this close to her supposed mate was agony. The bond was a living thing, a magnetic force pulling at her core, begging her to reveal herself, to submit, to claim and be claimed. To deny it, to actively push against it while under the scrutiny of a powerful alpha, was like trying to hold back a tidal wave with her bare hands. "Where are you from?" Ryker began. His voice a calm, level baritone that was somehow more intimidating than a shout. "A small town upstate," she lied, reciting the backstory she had rehearsed 1,000 times. "Fell on hard times. Came here looking for work. No family. No. They passed away a few years ago." Another lie, one that left a bitter taste in her mouth. Her family hadn't passed away. They had cast her out, terrified of the shadows she could command. He circled the counter, moving with a fluid grace that was utterly silent. He was behind her now, his heat a palpable presence at her back. She could feel the fine hairs on her arms stand on end. Her carefully constructed shield of scentless anonymity was flickering, threatening to shatter under the force of his proximity. 1,000 tiny needles of pain pricked at the inside of her skull as she fought to hold it together. "You're an exceptional liar," he murmured, his voice close to her ear. His breath was warm against her skin, sending a shiver down her spine that was not entirely from fear. "But I can smell it on you. Not a scent. Lack of one. Void. An illusion. What are you hiding, little human?" Kaela squeezed her eyes shut, her knuckles white where she gripped the edge of the counter. "I don't know what you're talking about." A low, frustrated growl rumbled in his chest. The sound vibrated right through her, speaking to the shifter part of her she kept chained down. The shadows in the corners of the diner deepened, swaying almost imperceptibly, responding to her agitation. She quickly reined them in, praying he hadn't noticed. He noticed everything. He stepped in front of her again, his silver eyes narrowed. "I am going to ask you one more time. Who are you, and what are you doing in my territory?" "I'm a waitress," she insisted, her voice gaining a desperate, hysterical edge that wasn't entirely faked. "My name is Kaela. I'm human." Ryker stared at her for a long, silent moment. He saw the genuine panic now, the sheer terror of a cornered animal. But he also saw the unyielding core of defiance beneath it. He was a lie detector honed by a century of sniffing out deceit in his own kind, and every instinct told him she was hiding a truth of monumental proportions. The bond was a fire in his blood. He couldn't let her go. He couldn't walk away from this mystery. If she was a threat, he needed her close. If she was his mate, he needed her closer. "Fine," he said, the single word sharp and final. He straightened up, his demeanor shifting from interrogator to judge and jury. "If you won't tell me the truth, I'll have to keep you until I find it myself." Kaela's blood ran cold. "What? You can't do that." A humorless smile touched his lips. "Can't I? You are in my territory. You are a mystery my wolf will not allow me to ignore. You are, for all intents and purposes, now my problem." He gestured to the door where his enforcer, Finn, had reappeared as silently as a ghost. "You will be coming with me. You will be my guest at the pack house until I am satisfied with your answers." The word guest was a lie. She knew what she was. Captive. A prisoner in a cage of glass, where her every move would be watched by the one man whose soul was tied to hers, and whose suspicions could get her killed. Chapter 4. The Scent of Chamomile. Ryker's packhouse was not a rustic den but a modern fortress of steel, glass, and dark stone built into the side of a mountain overlooking the city. It was a statement of power, a seamless blend of the primal and the sophisticated. To Kaela, it was the most beautiful prison she had ever seen. She was given a room in a quiet wing, luxurious and comfortable, with a panoramic window and a bathroom stocked with expensive toiletries. The only thing it lacked was a lock on the inside of the door. Her weak human persona meant she was deemed no physical threat, but Ryker wasn't taking any chances. A stern-faced female wolf named Ilara was assigned to assist her, a polite term for being her guard. From his office, a cavernous room with a window that matched hers, Ryker watched her. He had a direct line of sight to her balcony. He saw her stand there, a small, fragile figure staring out at the vast wilderness, looking utterly alone. The sight stirred the protective beast inside him, a low growl of possessive satisfaction rumbling in his chest. She was here, contained. And yet, the paradox of her was driving him to the edge of madness. Finn entered the office, placing a thin file on the massive oak desk. "Everything we could find, Alpha. It's not much." Ryker opened it. The documents were all legal, all perfectly in order. A driver's license, a social security number, a birth certificate from a small town upstate that had suffered a courthouse fire a decade ago, conveniently destroying the original records. She had a sparse credit history, a few bills paid on time. She had existed officially for exactly 5 years. Before that she was a ghost. "A perfect ghost," Ryker murmured, closing the file. "A life constructed to withstand a cursory glance, but it falls apart under real scrutiny." "Her scent is the strangest part," Finn noted, his brow furrowed. "It's clean. Chamomile. It's not just her soap. It's in her laundry detergent, her cheap lotion. It's a deliberate, layered camouflage." Ryker nodded, a cold understanding dawning. "She's not just hiding. She is actively erasing herself, suppressing her natural scent with a manufactured one." It was a tactic he'd heard of, used by rogues on the run. But to do it so perfectly that even his alpha senses could barely find a trace of the person beneath, that took immense power. Frightening power. The mate bond was a constant, physical ache behind his ribs. A phantom pulled toward her room. He wanted to go to her, to shake her until the truth fell out, to press her against a wall and breathe her in until he found a single, honest note in her scent. He wanted to kiss the fear from her eyes and replace it with the fire he suspected she was hiding. The contradiction was tearing him apart. The alpha in him screamed that she was a potential threat, a spy, a cleverly disguised assassin sent by one of his rivals. She had to be broken. The wolf in him screamed that she was his mate, the other half of his soul, a precious treasure to be guarded and cherished. She had to be protected. He looked out the window again. She had wrapped her arms around herself, a gesture of self-comfort that made his heart clench. She looked so vulnerable. A lamb dropped in a wolf's den. A new strategy began to form in his mind. Interrogation had failed. Observation was yielding nothing but more questions. Perhaps it was time for a different approach. He wouldn't try to break her with force. He would create a crack in her armor. He would force her into a situation where her instincts would have to override her carefully constructed lies. He would put the lamb in a position where she had no choice but to show him the wolf she was hiding inside. Chapter 5, The First Touch. The opportunity Ryker was looking for came 2 days later. He had ordered Kaela to join the pack for the evening meal in the communal hall. It was a calculated move. He wanted to see her in his environment, surrounded by his people, to see how she would react to the overwhelming sensory input of 200 shifters in one place. Kaela walked into the hall with Alara at her side, her head down, her weak human armor pulled on as tightly as she could manage. The noise, the raw energy, the overlapping sense of dozens of wolves. It was a chaotic assault on her senses. The shadows in the corners of the vast, timber-framed hall seemed to writhe, drawn to the nervous energy pouring off her. She fought to keep them still. She was the immediate center of attention. Every head turned. Whispers followed her as Alara led her to a small, isolated table. A human. What is she to the alpha? It smells strange. From his seat at the head table on a raised dais, Ryker watched her every move. He saw the slight tremor in her hands, the way she kept her eyes fixed on her empty plate. She was a stone in a raging river, silent and still while the currents of pack life swirled around her. His test came in the form of 2 young, arrogant enforcers in training, Jorik and Bale. Full of more muscle than sense, they saw Kaela as an anomaly, a weakness in their alpha's judgment that they felt entitled to probe. They swaggered over to her table, their chests puffed out. "Look what we have here," Jorik sneered, leaning over her table. "The Alpha's new pet. Doesn't look like much, does she?" Kaela didn't look up. "Please leave me alone." "Ah, the little human has a voice," Bale mocked. He reached out and snatched the bread roll from her plate. "What are you going to do about it?" "Cry." This was a classic dominance play. Test of rank. If Kaela reacted with pure human fear, it would confirm their suspicions. If she showed any sign of shifter defiance, it would be a revelation. Kaela's heart was hammering, but beneath the fear, a cold, familiar rage began to stir. These were the kind of bullies who had made her childhood a living hell. She knew their type. She met Jorik's gaze, her own stormy eyes flat and unimpressed. "According to pack law, a guest of the Alpha is under his direct protection," she said, her voice quiet but clear, carrying in a lull in the hall's chatter. "To challenge me is to challenge his authority. Are you sure you want to do that where he can see you?" The entire hall went silent. Jorik and Bale froze, their sneers faltering. She had used their own rules against them, a move of surprising intelligence and audacity for a supposed human. But it wasn't enough. Enraged at being outsmarted, Jorik slammed his hand on the table. "You little—" He never finished the sentence. A blur of motion and a wave of killing intent washed over the hall. Ryker was there. He hadn't run. He had simply moved from the dais to Kaela's side in the space of a heartbeat. He grabbed Jorik by the throat, lifting him effortlessly from the floor. "You dare!" Ryker snarled, his voice a low, deathly promise. His silver eyes were blazing with pure, unrestrained alpha fury. In his haste to neutralize the threat, Ryker's other hand shot out, grabbing Kaela's arm to pull her behind him, shielding her with his body. The moment his skin touched hers, a bolt of white-hot lightning arced between them. It was not a spark. It was an explosion. A circuit completed. A soul-deep shock that made them both gasp. Kaela felt his raw power flood her senses, and for a terrifying second, her own shadowy power surged in response, desperate to meet his. Ryker felt it too, a distinct, undeniable jolt of something from her. Not the fragile energy of a human, but a deep, resonant power ancient and wild. He dropped Jorik, who scrambled away in terror. The hall was forgotten. The world narrowed to the point of contact. His hand wrapped around her arm. He stared down at her, his silver eyes wide with shock and dawning, triumphant certainty. The lie had just cracked, and through that crack he finally saw the truth. Chapter 6. The Shattered Mask. The world snapped back into focus with the sound of Jorik choking on the floor. The charged silence of the great hall was absolute, every pair of eyes locked on the Alpha and the small woman whose arm he gripped as if it were a lifeline. The jolt of power that had surged from her was undeniable. It was not the raw, feral energy of a wolf, but something else. Something ancient, deep, and as silent as the grave. It was a current of pure, controlled darkness, and it had answered the call of his own alpha power. Liar. The word seared through Ryker's mind, a fusion of white-hot rage and triumphant vindication. He didn't release her. His grip was like a manacle as he turned, his silver eyes blazing with a fire that made the entire hall hold its collective breath. He began to walk, pulling her with him, his strides long and purposeful. Kaela had no choice but to stumble along in his wake, her feet barely keeping up. She heard the scrape of chairs as the pack scrambled to their feet, the confused and fearful murmurs that followed them. Ilara made a move to intervene, her face etched with concern. "Alpha! Stay!" Ryker snarled over his shoulder, a single word of command so absolute that the powerful female warrior froze in place. He didn't take her back to the guest wing. He dragged her through the heart of the packhouse, up a grand winding staircase of dark stone and into his personal territory. The Alpha's wing. The doors to his suite were massive, carved from ancient oak, and they opened into a space that was less a room and more a personal kingdom. A wall of glass offered a breathtaking moonlit view of the entire valley. A massive fireplace, currently cold, dominated one wall, and the air was thick with his undiluted scent, pine, winter air, and pure authority. He finally released her arm, shoving her into the center of the room. The silence was deafening, broken only by their harsh breathing. Kaela rubbed her arm, the skin tingling and hot where he had held her. The mask was shattered. The lie was dead. There was nowhere left to run. For 3 days you have stood in my house, eaten my food, and looked me in the eye while wearing a pathetic human costume, Ryker began, his voice dangerously low as he slowly circled her. He was a wolf cornering its prey, his movements a fluid, lethal dance. You have played the part of a frightened lamb so perfectly. But a lamb does not have a soul that feels like a starless midnight. A lamb does not have power that answers my own. He stopped directly in front of her, close enough that she had to crane her neck to look up at him. The game is over, he growled, his silver eyes boring into her. You will tell me what you are. You will tell me who you are hiding from. You will tell me everything. Now. Fear, raw and genuine, warred with a lifetime of defiance. The shadows in the corners of his opulent suite deepened, stretching toward her like welcoming arms. Her power, suppressed for so long, was awake now, humming just beneath her skin, drawn out by the proximity of her mate and the intensity of his rage. A single, dark tendril, no thicker than a thread, snaked out from behind her, caressing the floor at her heel. She didn't have to look to know it was there. And neither did he. His gaze flickered down to the wisp of pure darkness on the floor, and then back to her face, a look of dangerous, predatory fascination dawning in his eyes. So, he breathed, a humorless smile twisting his lips. The little lamb has fangs after all. Chapter 7. A Shadow's Confession. The wisp of darkness at her heel was a betrayal, a confession her own lips refused to make. Kaela stared at Ryker, her heart hammering against her ribs. She saw the shock in his eyes give way to a fierce, almost hungry curiosity. He wasn't afraid. He wasn't repulsed. He was intrigued. This reaction was so alien to her that it threw her completely off balance. My power, it frightens people, she whispered, the words tasting of rust and old pain. It was the simplest, most honest truth she owned. I am not people, Ryker countered, his voice a low growl. He knelt, his movements surprisingly graceful for a man his size, and extended a hand toward the tendril of shadow. It recoiled from him, melting back into the floorboards. He looked back up at her, his silver eyes blazing. And I am not frightened. I'm your mate. I have a right to know the truth of what you are. Mate. The words were a brand, a claim, and a demand all in one. The bond between them, now that her true nature was exposed, was a roaring inferno in the space between them. The lies had acted as a dam, and now that it was cracked, the force of their connection was overwhelming. She backed away until her legs hit the cold stone of the hearth. There was no escape. She took a ragged breath. I am a shadow weaver, she confessed, the name of her kind feeling strange and heavy on her tongue. We are rare. We don't belong to any pack. We can draw on the darkness, shape it. And we can use it to hide, to erase our scent, to become nothing. Ryker rose to his feet and stalked toward her, his expression unreadable. An inherited trait. She shook her head. It manifests randomly. Throwback. A curse, my family called it. The memory was a fresh wound. The fear in her mother's eyes. The way her father had looked at her as if she were a monster. When my power emerged, they cast me out. They were afraid of what the ruling packs would do if they found out their daughter was an abomination. She was giving him a partial truth. It was easier to paint herself as a tragic outcast than to reveal the full, terrifying reason she was on the run. Ryker stopped in front of her, caging her against the mantelpiece. He was so close she could feel the heat rolling off his body. He lifted a hand and tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear, his calloused fingertips brushing the sensitive skin of her neck. The touch was electric, sending a shiver through her entire body. So you ran, he murmured, his voice softer now, laced with a grudging understanding. You ran and you hid, and you pretended to be a weak, fragile human because you were afraid of your own strength. I was afraid of being seen, she corrected, her voice trembling. Of being used. Or killed. His gaze was intense, searching. Is that who you are hiding from? Your family? Old pack rivals? Everyone, she whispered, which wasn't entirely a lie. He leaned in closer, his forehead almost touching hers. His scent was overwhelming, making her dizzy. Your hiding is over, Kaela, he breathed. His voice a possessive rumble that vibrated straight to her soul. You are not an outcast anymore. You are not alone. You are the mate of an alpha. This pack is now your pack. This territory is your territory. And your power. His thumb stroked her jawline, a feather-light touch that felt like a brand. Your power is a gift, not a curse. And I will be the one to teach you how to use it. His words were a promise and a threat. He was claiming everything, her past, her future, and the shadows she had always called her own. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was now tangled with a new, terrifying emotion. A flicker of hope. Chapter 8. The Price of Truth. The truth, or at least the part of it Kaela had revealed, spread through the packhouse like wildfire. The story of the Alpha's human pet was replaced by a far more shocking and potent rumor. The Alpha had found his mate, and she was a shadow weaver. The name itself was a whisper from legend, a creature of myth and fear. Some looked at Kaela with a new, wary respect. Others with suspicion. A shadow weaver was an unknown quantity, a wild card. Her presence fundamentally changed the pack's power dynamics. Ryker, however, was a master strategist. He understood that power vacuums and uncertainty led to dissent. He needed to solidify her position and his claim, immediately and unequivocally. The next evening, he called for another communal meal. This time, when Kaela entered the great hall, she was not led to a small, isolated table. Ryker was waiting for her just inside the doors. As the hall fell silent, he held out his hand. It was a simple public gesture, but it was laden with a meaning no one in the room could mistake. Her heart hammered. This was it. The end of her anonymity. Her hand trembled as she placed it in his. His grip was warm and firm, engulfing her smaller hand completely. He led her not to the floor, but up the dais to the head table, to the seat directly at his right hand. The seat of the Luna. He held her chair for her, a gesture of old-world chivalry that seemed at odds with his savage nature. As she sat, he leaned down, his lips brushing her ear. They need to see you as I see you, he murmured, his voice for her alone. Not as a threat, but as their queen. Throughout the meal, he kept her close. His arm rested on the back of her chair, his fingers occasionally brushing her shoulder. He drew her into conversations with his senior pack members, forcing them to acknowledge her, to speak to her not as an oddity, but as the Alpha's chosen. It was terrifying and intoxicating. Kaela felt the weight of hundreds of shifter eyes on her, analyzing her, judging her. But for the first time she wasn't alone. Ryker was a formidable shield. His possessive aura a clear, unspoken warning to anyone who might show her disrespect. The true test came after the meal. Jorik, the enforcer who had challenged her, was brought before the dais, flanked by 2 guards. He knelt, his head bowed, unable to meet Ryker's icy gaze. You challenged a guest under my protection, Ryker's voice boomed, filled with cold alpha authority. You now know she is more than a guest. She is your Luna. You did not just insult her. You insulted me and you insulted this pack. There is a price for such insubordination. Ryker looked at Kaela. What should his punishment be? The question was a shock. He was giving her power, forcing her to wield it in front of them all. This was a test. She could call for a harsh punishment, earning a reputation for cruelty. She could be too lenient, appearing weak. She looked down at the terrified young wolf. She saw not a threat, but a foolish boy who had let his arrogance get the better of him. She remembered what it felt like to be an outcast, to be judged and found wanting. "He was testing a stranger," Kaela said, her voice clear and steady, carrying across the silent hall. "His methods were wrong, but his loyalty to the pack's safety was his motivation. He has learned his lesson." She looked directly at Jorik. "There will be no punishment from me. Just a warning. My mate's authority is absolute. Challenge it again, and you will answer to me." A collective, indrawn breath echoed through the hall. She had claimed Ryker as her mate. She had shown mercy, but laced it with a threat of her own power. She had acted like a true Luna. Ryker's silver eyes blazed with a fierce, possessive pride. He reached over and placed his hand over hers on the table, his thumb stroking her knuckles in a gesture of absolute approval. He had laid his claim, and she, in turn, had claimed him right back. The price of the truth, she was beginning to realize, was the loss of her freedom. But what she was gaining in its place felt infinitely more powerful. Chapter 9. The First Lesson. Kaela's display in the Great Hall had solidified her position, but it had also illuminated a stark reality for Ryker. Her power was a wild, untamed thing, responding to her emotions on pure instinct. If she was to be his Luna, his queen, she could not be afraid of the very weapon she possessed. She had to master it. The following afternoon, he led her from the packhouse, away from the prying eyes, to a secluded clearing deep within the ancient woods of his territory. A circle of moss-covered, monolithic stones stood like silent sentinels, a place of old power where generations of alphas had trained. "This is a place of balance," Ryker explained, his voice echoing slightly in the quiet clearing. "The air here is clean. No lingering emotions. It will be easier for you to focus." "Focus on what?" Kaela asked, wrapping her arms around herself. The woods were beautiful, but the purpose of their visit sent a familiar anxiety coiling in her gut. "On this," he said. He turned to face one of the massive stones, 10 feet away. He closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them, the silver irises seemed to glow with an inner light. He didn't move a muscle, but the air around the stone shimmered. With a low crunch, a network of hairline fractures appeared on the rock's surface. He had projected his pure alpha will, his raw power, and used it to physically damage solid stone. Kaela stared, her mouth agape. "That is control," he said, turning back to her. "It is the focusing of instinct into a tool. Your power responds to your fear and your anger. I want you to make it respond to your will. Show me." "Call the shadows." She shook her head. "I can't. Not like that. They just come." "Then make them," he insisted, his voice hard, the voice of a commander, not a mate. "You are not a slave to your power, Kaela. You are its master. Now call them." She closed her eyes and tried. She reached for the familiar cool darkness that lived inside her, trying to pull it forward, to shape it. But all she felt was fear. The memory of her family's horrified faces, the sting of being called a monster. The shadows remained dormant. "I can't," she whispered, her voice thick with frustration and shame. Ryker's patience snapped. He crossed the space between them in 2 long strides, grabbing her by the shoulders. His grip was firm, his silver eyes blazing down at her. "Yes, you can. You are afraid of what I will think. You are afraid I will see you as they did. As an abomination." "Aren't I?" she cried, the painful question finally breaking free. "No," he roared, the sheer force of his voice making the leaves on the trees tremble. "You are magnificent. The power I felt from you. It is a part of you, the truest part. To deny it is to deny yourself. Stop being afraid of it. Stop being afraid of me." To prove his point, he pulled her flush against him. His body was a wall of muscle and heat, his scent enveloping her. One of his hands moved to the small of her back, pressing her impossibly closer, while the other cupped the back of her head, his fingers tangling in her hair. "Your power answered mine in the hall," he growled, his lips just inches from hers. Let it answer me now. Let me see you, Kaela. The real you. His proximity, his raw intensity, the primal demand in his voice. It was all too much. Her control shattered. The fear, the anger, the frustration, and the terrifying, undeniable desire for this man all coalesced into a single point. The shadows exploded from her. They didn't just darken the corners of the clearing. They erupted from the ground, solid, tangible tendrils of pure night. They swirled around them, a vortex of silent, cold energy, blotting out the afternoon sun. They caressed Ryker's arms and shoulders, tasting his power, recognizing him. Kaela stood in the eye of her own storm, her eyes wide with terror at the force she had just unleashed. But Ryker didn't flinch. He didn't pull away. He simply stared at her, a look of utter, breathtaking awe on his face. Chapter 10, Taste of Darkness. The storm of shadows swirled around them, a living manifestation of all the power Kaela had kept chained inside her for years. It was a terrifying, beautiful sight. The air grew cold, and the only sound was the thundering of her own heart. She waited for the fear, for the revulsion in Ryker's eyes that she had seen so many times before. But it never came. He looked at her, standing in the heart of her unleashed power, and he smiled. It was not a smirk or a grin, but a genuine, breathtaking smile of pure admiration. "There you are," he breathed, his voice filled with a reverence that made her knees weak. He raised a hand, not to ward off the shadows, but to welcome them. A thick, inky tendril coiled around his forearm, and he didn't even flinch. He was touching her power, her very essence, and his only reaction was awe. The sight of his acceptance, so total and absolute, was the final key that unlocked her. The years of fear, of self-loathing, of loneliness, it all came crashing down. A single tear traced a path down her cheek. Ryker saw it, and his smile faded, replaced by a look of fierce tenderness. "Never cry for this," he commanded softly. "Never be ashamed of this." He released her shoulders and cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently wiping away her tears. The shadows, sensing the shift in her emotions from turmoil to overwhelming relief, began to calm, receding slowly back into the earth, leaving them standing in the dappled sunlight of the clearing. "You are not a monster, Kaela," he murmured, his silver eyes searching hers. "You are a queen who has been forced to wear a pauper's rags. And I will never let you forget your crown again." The raw conviction in his voice, the worship in his gaze, it shattered the last of her defenses. All the simmering tension, the forbidden desire, the undeniable pull of the mate bond, surged to the surface. He lowered his head, and this time there was no hesitation, no testing. He claimed her mouth in a kiss that was both a conquest and a surrender. It was a kiss of searing, desperate passion, a fusion of his iron control and her wild darkness. The taste of him was exactly as she had imagined: winter and authority, power and pine. It was the taste of safety and danger intertwined. A groan rumbled deep in his chest as he deepened the kiss, his tongue sweeping into her mouth to claim her, to learn her. And Kaela, for the first time in her life, didn't hide. She met his passion with her own, her hands coming up to grip his jacket, pulling him closer. She kissed him back with all the pent-up loneliness and newfound hope in her soul. She tasted of night and secrets, and he drank her in like a man dying of thirst. This was not the gentle comfort of a budding romance. This was a claiming. He was claiming the shadow weaver, not the timid waitress. He was kissing the power she had feared, the darkness she had hidden. And in his arms, she finally understood that her shadows were not a curse. They were simply a part of her that had been waiting for the right person to see their beauty. When they finally broke apart, both breathless and trembling, he rested his forehead against hers. The world had irrevocably shifted. The line between captor and captive, between alpha and outcast, had been erased. "Mine," he growled, the word a possessive, sacred vow against her lips. And for the first time the word didn't sound like a cage. Sounded like a promise. Chapter 11. The Scars We Don't See. The clearing was silent in the aftermath of their kiss, the air still humming with the residue of Kaela's power. The raw, desperate passion had ebbed, leaving behind a profound and unnerving intimacy. Ryker hadn't released her, his hands still framing her face, his forehead resting against hers. He was breathing her in, not just her scent but her very essence. He had seen her, all of her, and he hadn't run. He led her back to the packhouse by the hand, their fingers laced together in a gesture that felt both natural and terrifyingly new. The pack members they passed averted their gazes, a clear sign of deference not just to their alpha, but to the woman at his side. The whispers had been replaced by impalpable respect. They had all felt the shift of power from the training grounds. Back in the quiet sanctuary of his suite, the adrenaline faded, leaving Kaela feeling raw and exposed. Ryker poured them both a glass of water, his movements calm and deliberate. He handed one to her, his knuckles brushing hers, the brief contact sending a familiar jolt through her veins. "They are beautiful," he said, his voice a low rumble. He was staring at her, but she knew he wasn't talking about her face or her eyes. He was talking about her shadows. She took a shaky sip of water, her gaze dropping to the floor. "They are dangerous." "So is a wolf," he countered, sitting on the edge of the large leather sofa, leaving space for her. "So is an alpha. Power is only dangerous when it is uncontrolled or used for evil. Yours is neither." Hesitantly, she sat beside him, leaving a careful foot of space between them. He didn't try to close the distance. He was giving her room to breathe, a silent act of patience that she was beginning to recognize as a core part of him, warring constantly with his possessive instincts. As she moved to set her glass down on the heavy wooden table, he made a sudden sharp gesture toward a book that was about to fall off the edge. It was a quick, reflexive movement, but Kaela flinched violently, her hands flying up to protect her head, a small, choked gasp escaping her lips. The motion was instantaneous, instinctual, and utterly revealing. Ryker froze, his hand hovering in the air. The easy atmosphere in the room evaporated, replaced by a deadly, cold stillness. He slowly retracted his hand, his silver eyes narrowing, all traces of the gentle mate gone, replaced by the lethal alpha. "Who taught you to fear a man's raised hand?" he asked, his voice dangerously soft. Her blood ran cold. It was one thing to confess the truth of her powers. It was another thing entirely to unveil the ugly, shameful secrets that had put the fear there in the first place. "It's nothing," she lied, her voice thin. "Do not lie to me, Kaela," he growled, the sound a low warning. "Not anymore. I've tasted your soul. I know its strength. Now show me its scars." Tears pricked at her eyes. He wasn't just asking about her family anymore. He was asking for the real reason she was so adept at hiding, so fluent in the language of fear. He was asking for the whole truth. "The people I'm hiding from," she began, her voice a fractured whisper. "It's not my family. It's an organization. They call themselves the Consortium." Ryker's entire body went rigid, his posture shifting from relaxed to coiled iron. He knew the name. It was a boogeyman, a ghost story whispered among shifters, a shadowy group that supposedly hunted and collected rare supernatural talents. "They found out about me," Kaela continued, the words tumbling out now that the dam was broken. "They don't see power as a gift. They see it as a resource, a weapon to be controlled. They came for me. They wanted to break me, to train me, to turn me into their personal assassin." She subconsciously touched her arm, the memory of chains and cold rooms rising in her mind. "I escape, but not before I learned what they do to those who resist." She finally lifted her head and met his gaze, letting him see the old terror in her eyes. "That is why I pretended to be human. It's not just the fear of being an outcast. It's the fear of being found, of being dragged back to that place and forged into a monster." The silence that followed was heavy, absolute. Ryker was no longer looking at a mysterious mate with a fascinating power. He was looking at a survivor, a fugitive from an evil he had only ever considered a myth. The final piece of the puzzle that was Kaela had just snapped into place, and the picture it revealed was one of profound suffering, incredible resilience, and a danger that was far from over. Chapter 12, A Hunted Queen. The name Consortium hung in the air of the suite, a poison that changed everything. Ryker's face had become a mask of stone, but his silver eyes were a raging storm. He rose from the sofa and walked to the massive window, staring out at the peaceful valley that was his domain. Peace was a lie. An infection had been festering at his borders, and its name was now known to him. "Tell me everything," he commanded, his back still to her. His voice was devoid of warmth, stripped down to the cold, hard steel of the Alpha at war. So she did. She told him about their leader, a cold, ancient shifter known only as the Director. She described their methods: psychological torture, brutal training regimens, the way they broke down a person's will until all that was left was obedience. She told him how they had found her, through a network of informants who were paid to report any sign of rare supernatural occurrences. "I was careless," she whispered, shame coloring her voice. "A moment of anger, a loss of control in a back alley. That's all it took for them to find my trail." "It was not your fault," Ryker said, his voice a low, vicious growl. "It was theirs for daring to hunt on lands that will one day be mine." He turned from the window, and the raw, murderous fury on his face made her breath catch. This was a side of him she had not seen before. This was not the possessive mate or the patient teacher. This was the warlord. "The game has changed," he stated, crossing the room to an intercom panel on the wall. "This is no longer about hiding you. This is about eradicating them." He pressed the button. "Finn. To my office. Full Security Council." The energy in the pack house shifted almost instantly. A silent alarm, a call to arms, spread through the ranks. Within minutes, Kaela could hear the heavy, purposeful footsteps of the pack's senior command moving through the halls. Ryker looked at her, his eyes blazing. "You are not going back to the guest wing. You will stay here with me. No one enters this suite without my direct permission. Ilara will be your constant shadow outside that door. You will not be left alone for a single second." His commands were absolute. His protective instincts now dialed up to a terrifying degree. He saw her flinch slightly at the intensity, and his expression softened for a fraction of a second. He came to her, kneeling before her, taking her hands in his. "This is not a punishment, Kaela," he said, his voice regaining a sliver of its earlier warmth. "This is not a cage. This is a fortress. My fortress. And you are its queen. I am not locking you in. I am locking them out." A wave of emotion so profound it made her dizzy washed over her. For 5 years she had been prey. She had run, hidden, and lived in constant gnawing fear. Now, in the space of a single conversation, she had become the catalyst for a war. The full, terrifying might of the Black Moon Pack was being mobilized, not for territory or for honor, but for her. She watched him stride from the suite toward his office, his enforcers falling into step behind him. She was no longer just his fated mate. She was his cause. His justification for unleashing the full lethal power he held in reserve. She went to the window, the same one he had looked through, and gazed down at the pack lands. A new wave of patrols was already moving out, disappearing into the dark woods like ghosts. She had brought this danger to his doorstep, a danger he had never asked for. A deep, aching guilt began to settle in her chest. But as she stood there, a thought, clear and sharp as glass, cut through the guilt. The Consortium had hunted her. They had treated her like an animal, an object to be collected. They had no idea who they had truly provoked. Ryker's words echoed in her mind. They were hunting a weapon. They have no idea they just started a war with a king. And that king, she realized with a shiver of terrifying, thrilling power, had just made her his queen. Chapter 13, Whispers in the Dark. Life in the pack house transformed overnight. The casual, communal atmosphere was replaced by the disciplined hum of a war camp. Patrols were doubled, the borders fortified. Every member of the pack moved with a new, grim purpose. And Kaela was at the center of it all, a protected, revered, and isolated figure. She was confined to Ryker's wing of the house, a luxurious prison designed for her own safety. Ryker spent most of his days in the war room with his council, poring over maps and intelligence reports, planning his hunt. But every evening he returned to her, and her training would begin. It was different now. It was no longer about simple control. It was about application. "The consortium hunted you because your power is the perfect tool for espionage," he said one night, as they stood on the balcony overlooking the moonlit forest. "To defeat them, we must understand their methods. We must become better hunters than they are." He held up a hand. "Close your eyes. Don't just call the shadows. Send them. Extend your senses through them. I want you to reach that large oak tree at the edge of the clearing." Kaela hesitated. "Spying. Using my power to listen in. It feels wrong." "War is not about what feels right," he countered, his voice firm. "It is about survival. It is about protecting our own. Your ability to gather information without being seen is a weapon they would kill for. We will use it to tear them down. Now try." The steamy tension that had defined their earlier encounters was now woven into these lessons. He would stand behind her, his body a warm, solid presence, his hands guiding her posture, his voice a low murmur in her ear. The contact was intimate, instructional, and it sent shivers of awareness through her that had nothing to do with the cool night air. She closed her eyes and reached for the darkness. This time, instead of letting it erupt, she visualized it as a thin, silken thread. She pushed it out from herself, slowly, carefully, across the manicured lawn toward the distant tree. It was an incredible strain. She could feel the cool bark of the tree, hear the rustle of a squirrel in its branches, smell the damp earth at its roots, all through the sliver of shadow she had sent. "Good," Ryker breathed, his lips close to her temple. "You are a natural. You've spent so long using them to hide yourself, you never learned to use them to see the world." Day after day he pushed her. She learned to weave the shadows into thin, undetectable veils that could muffle sound. She learned to create pockets of absolute darkness to conceal movement. She learned to extend her senses, listening to conversations in the mess hall, tracking the movements of guards at the gate, all from the safety of his suite. The feeling was intoxicating. The power she had once feared as a curse was revealing itself to be an incredible gift. The guilt of being a liability, a burden who had brought danger to his people, began to recede, replaced by a growing sense of purpose. She was not just the Alpha's mate, a figurehead to be protected. She was a weapon, his secret weapon. One evening, while practicing, she overheard two junior guards complaining at their post on the western wall. They spoke of a local human trapper who had been seen near the border, acting strangely, asking too many questions about pack patrols. It was low-level intelligence, something that would likely have been dismissed. But when she told Ryker, his eyes lit up with a cold, predatory fire. "The consortium uses humans," he said. "Informants, spies. They're called collectors. They gather information before the assassins move in." He immediately dispatched Finn to have a conversation with the trapper. Kaela watched him go, a thrill of power running through her. She hadn't just overheard gossip. She had identified a potential threat. She had protected his people. She had drawn first blood in their secret war. The timid waitress was gone. In her place, a queen was beginning to understand the true nature of her crown. Chapter 14. The Enemy at the Gates. The trapper, under Finn's expert and terrifyingly persuasive interrogation, broke within an hour. He was indeed a collector for the consortium, paid handsomely to report on the Black Moon Pack's movements. He confirmed their worst fears. A specialized cell of consortium operatives was already in the region, preparing to infiltrate Ryker's territory. They weren't coming for a fight. They were coming for an abduction. They were coming for Kaela. The information, delivered by Finn in the starkly lit war room, landed like a death knell. The threat was no longer a shadowy, What if? Had a name, a location, and a timeline. They're using the old abandoned mine shafts north of the river as a staging ground, Finn reported, tapping a location on the large topographical map. The trapper was their eyes. They planned to move within the next 48 hours. Ryker stared at the map, his jaw tight, his silver eyes like chips of ice. They are arrogant. They think they can walk into my home and steal my mate from under my nose. Kaela stood beside him, her hand resting on the back of his chair. The guilt she had been battling returned with a vengeance. This was real. People could die. "This is my fault," she whispered, her voice so low only he could hear. He turned, his hand covering hers on the chair, his grip a reassuring pressure. "No," he said, his voice a low, fierce growl that was also for her alone. "This is not your fault. This is my war. You were just the reason it started. Now we will be the reason it ends." That night, the pack house was a hive of silent, lethal activity. Warriors checked their gear, scouts moved out into the darkness, and a grim, focused energy settled over everyone. The hunt was on. But the consortium was faster and more ruthless than they had anticipated. Just after midnight, a frantic call came in from the Southern Border Patrol, a sector far from the mines. There had been an attack. Diversion. While Ryker's main force was preparing to strike the northern staging ground, a smaller elite team had struck the opposite end of his territory. Ryker, Kaela, and his command council rushed to the main gate to meet the returning warriors. 2 of them were carried in on stretchers, their bodies covered in blood. But they were alive. 1 was missing. "It was a feint, Alpha," the wounded patrol leader gasped, clutching his side. They were impossibly fast. Not wolves. They moved like shadows. They took Marcus and vanished. Kaela felt a wave of nausea. A man was captured, or worse, because of her. She closed her eyes, instinctively reaching out with her power, not as a spy, but as a seeker. She cast a veil of shadow over the territory, trying to feel for the disturbance, for the foreign energy the patrol leader had described. She pushed her senses toward the southern border, past the chaos and pain of the attack site. And then she felt it. Faint, cold trail. It was a lingering residue of power, utterly alien. It felt soulless. It was the energy of something that mimicked darkness but had no true substance. It was the power of the consortium's assassins. "They're not heading away from the territory," she said suddenly, her eyes snapping open. Everyone in the war room turned to stare at her. "They're heading toward the city. Toward Northgate. They're using the human population as cover." Ryker stared at her, his silver eyes blazing with a new understanding. His scouts, his warriors, they could track wolves, humans, any natural creature. But they couldn't track this. They couldn't track an energy that didn't belong in their world. But she could. In that moment, she was no longer the protected queen or the secret weapon. She was the pack's most vital asset. She was the only one who could see the enemy hiding in the dark. Chapter 15, 2 halves of a whole. The revelation that only Kaela could track the consortium assassins changed the entire strategy of the hunt. The war room buzzed with a new kind of energy as Ryker issued a series of rapid-fire commands. The strike on the northern mines was still on, led by Finn, but its purpose was now secondary: to capture and destroy their base of operations. The primary mission, the true hunt, was now his. And Kaela was his only guide. A small, elite team was assembled. Ryker, Kaela, and 4 of his most trusted ghost wolves, warriors who specialized in stealth and urban combat. They would enter Northgate under the cover of the pre-dawn gloom and follow the trail only she could sense. The hours before they left were a blur of quiet, intense preparation. As his warriors geared up, Ryker pulled Kaela into the privacy of his suite. The weight of what was to come hung heavy between them. He was about to lead a hunt into a human city, risking exposure and a war on 2 fronts, all to save one of his men and eliminate the threat to her. He came to her and cupped her face in his hands, his expression a mixture of grim resolve and a fierce, aching tenderness. "Are you ready for this?" She nodded, her fear a cold knot in her stomach, but her resolve was a fire that burned hotter. What I am about to do will formalize our union, he said. His voice a low, serious rumble. It will bind us not just in spirit but in power. It will strengthen us for the fight ahead, but there is no going back from it. It is my soul recognizing yours in a way that all of our kind will understand. She knew what he meant. The Alpha's mark. The final, irrevocable claim. Unyielding force of his will. And he, in turn, felt her shadows, the silent depths of her power, the resilience forged in fear. When he lifted his head, a single drop of his blood sealed the wound, and the mark began to glow with a faint, silvery light before fading into her skin, leaving a permanent, invisible brand. They stared at each other, both panting, their eyes wide with the sheer magnitude of what had just happened. They were no longer two separate beings drawn together by fate. They were two halves of a single entity, bonded in flesh, spirit, and power. He was the winter storm and she was the starless night. He was the iron fist, and she was the hidden dagger. He pressed his forehead to hers, their shared power humming in the space between them. Now we are one, he growled, his voice thick with possessive pride. She looked into his blazing silver eyes and felt no fear. Only a sense of absolute completion. The hunt was waiting. The enemy was near. But for the first time she was not the prey. She was the hunter. And she would walk into the fire at her Alpha's side. Chapter 16. The Scent of the City. Northgate before dawn was a different city. The familiar streets were washed in the eerie orange glow of streetlights, the alleys and doorways filled with deep, inviting shadows. To Kaela's newly enhanced senses, the city was a symphony of information. The lingering scent of exhaust fumes, the smell of rain on pavement, the faint trail of fear from a mugging 2 blocks over. It was all there. And woven through it all, cold and sharp as a shard of glass, was the soulless trail of the consortium assassins. They moved like ghosts, a 6-person team clad in dark, functional gear. Ryker and his ghost wolves were specters of silent, lethal grace, but Kaela was their compass. This way, she'd murmur, her eyes closed as she focused on the alien energy signature. They went down into the old subway access. Ryker would give a series of sharp, silent hand signals, and his team would melt into the darkness, repositioning themselves without a sound. He never questioned her, never hesitated. His trust in her was absolute, a silent, unshakable bond that resonated between them, stronger than any verbal command. The power from his mark was a constant, warm hum beneath her skin. It didn't just feel like his energy. It felt like a part of her own. Her shadows were denser, easier to command, and her senses were a razor's edge. She could feel the steady thrum of Ryker's heart, even when he was 10 feet away. She could feel his calm, focused rage as if it were a shield around her. They followed the trail into the city's underbelly, a labyrinth of forgotten tunnels and maintenance shafts beneath the streets. The cold trail grew stronger. "They've stopped," Kaela whispered, her hand tightening on Ryker's arm. They were in a wide, circular junction room, the air thick with the smell of mildew and decay. "They're close. And they have him with them. Marcus. He's alive." Ryker's silver eyes scanned the darkness, his nostrils flaring. "It's a trap," he growled, his voice a low vibration only she could feel. "They know we're here. They want us in the open." He was right. The moment he spoke, a series of high-powered, blindingly bright lights flickered on, illuminating the junction and pinning them in the center. From 4 different tunnels, figures emerged. They were not shifters. They were tall, gaunt figures in sleek, black body armor, their faces obscured by reflective visors. They moved with an unnatural silent speed. The soulless energy signature Kaela had been tracking rolled off them in waves. In the center of the group stood a man in a long, dark coat. He was older, with a cruel, thin-lipped smile and eyes as cold and dead as a frozen lake. He held a struggling, gagged Marcus by the collar of his shirt. "Alpha Ryker," the man said, his voice smooth and laced with a chilling amusement. How kind of you to come. I am the director. And you have brought me the prize I was seeking. His dead eyes fixed on Kaela. It was him. The man from her nightmares. The architect of her pain. Her blood ran cold. Ryker stepped in front of her, a living shield of muscle and fury. His ghost wolves fanned out, their hands hovering over the blades strapped to their thighs. "Release my man," Ryker commanded, his voice echoing in the cavernous space, imbued with the full, bone-shaking power of his alpha command. The director merely chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "Your parlor tricks won't work on me, Alpha. Or on my specters." He gestured to the armored figures. "They are quite resistant to suggestion." "Then you will die here," Ryker stated, not as a threat, but as an undeniable fact. "Perhaps," the director mused, his eyes gleaming. "But first, I think it's time for a reunion." He gave Marcus a vicious shove forward. "We have been tracking your little shadow for a very long time. It was a shame she escaped our tutelage. But all property is eventually recovered." The word property was a spark on a fuse. A low, murderous snarl ripped from Ryker's throat. The temperature in the room dropped. The battle was no longer a matter of if, but when. And in the heart of the standoff, Kaela felt the shadows around them stir, eager and hungry. Chapter 17. Symphony of Shadows and Steel. The fight began not with a shout, but with a whisper of displaced air. The director made a subtle hand gesture, and two of his specters lunged forward, moving with a speed that was a blur to the human eye. But Ryker's ghost wolves were faster. Steel sang as their blades, forged from silver-infused alloy, met the specters' armored limbs. The fight was a symphony of brutal, close-quarters combat. The specters were unnaturally strong and silent, but the wolves were a whirlwind of feral grace and pack tactics, moving in a coordinated dance of death. Ryker met the first two specters himself, a blur of dark motion. He didn't use a blade. He used his bare hands, his strength, his sheer alpha power. He moved through their attacks, his fists and elbows striking with the force of a battering ram, denting their advanced armor, breaking the limbs within. The director watched with a detached, clinical interest, still holding Marcus as a shield. His cold eyes, however, were fixed on Kaela. "You see, my dear," he called out over the sounds of the fight. "This is the chaos you could have commanded. Instead, you chose to be a pet." His words were meant to sting, to distract. But they did the opposite. They ignited the cold rage that had been simmering in Kaela's soul. "Property." She closed her eyes, shutting out the chaos of the fight. She reached for the darkness, not just in the tunnel, but inside herself. The power of Ryker's mark flared, a bonfire in her veins, feeding her own abilities, amplifying them. "I am not a pet," she whispered to herself. When she opened her eyes, they were pools of pure, starless night. She lifted her hands, and the shadows in the vast junction room didn't just stir. They erupted. Thick, inky tendrils of solid darkness shot up from the floor. They weren't wisps. They were pythons of pure void. One wrapped around a specter's leg, yanking him off balance. Another formed a blinding, suffocating cloud around a second's head, making him stumble blindly into a ghost wolf's blade. Ryker, having just shattered the arm of one opponent, saw what she was doing. He didn't just see chaos, he saw a strategy, a new, terrifying symphony. He gave a sharp, wolfish bark, a command. Instantly, his wolves changed their tactics. They stopped engaging directly, instead weaving and dodging, forcing the specters into the areas where Kaela's shadows were thickest. It became their dance. She was the conductor, and the ghost wolves were her instruments. She would trap, blind, and disorient, and they would deliver the killing blow. One specter, trying to aim a weapon, found his hands encased in solid, unyielding darkness. A wolf darted in, and the threat was neutralized. The director's cruel smile finally faltered as he watched his elite assassins being dismantled by a power he thought he could control. He stared at Kaela, no longer with the gaze of a collector, but with the dawning horror of a man who had profoundly, catastrophically miscalculated. He shoved Marcus to the ground and drew a wicked-looking pistol. "You were supposed to be mine," he shrieked, his composure shattering. He aimed the gun not at Ryker, but directly at Kaela. Time seemed to slow. Ryker was too far away, locked in combat. The wolves were engaged. The shot was clear. But the director had forgotten one thing. He was standing in Kaela's domain. Before he could pull the trigger, the shadow beneath his own feet rose up. It wasn't a tendril. It was a solid three-dimensional claw of pure darkness that solidified around his gun hand, crushing the weapon and the bones within it into a mangled ruin. He screamed, a high, thin sound of agony and disbelief. Ryker used that moment. He launched himself across the room, a predator closing the distance. He slammed into the director, sending them both crashing against the hard concrete wall. The last of the specters fell to the ghost wolves' blades. The fight was over. Silence, punctuated by the director's ragged, pain-filled breaths, descended upon the tunnel. Kaela let the shadows recede, her body trembling with the sheer effort of the power she had just wielded. She had not been a liability. She had not been a victim. She had been the weapon that had turned the tide of the entire battle. Chapter 18: The King and His Queen. Ryker held the director pinned against the wall by his throat, his silver eyes blazing with a cold, merciless fire. The man who had been the architect of Kaela's nightmares was now just a broken, gasping man. "You took one of my pack," Ryker growled, his voice a low, lethal vibration. "You threatened my mate. You will tell me everything about the consortium, every base, every name, every operation, or your end will be a new legend they tell to frighten their children." The ghost wolves secured the area, freeing a bruised but living Marcus, their movements efficient and silent. But their eyes kept flicking to Kaela with a new, profound awe. She was no longer just the Alpha's mate. She was the Shadow Queen who had fought beside them, a power to be respected and feared. Kaela's legs felt weak, the adrenaline draining away, leaving a deep, bone-weary exhaustion in its wake. She had wielded more power in the last 10 minutes than she had in her entire life. Ryker seemed to sense her fatigue through the bond. Without taking his eyes off the director, he spoke. "Kael, see to the Luna." One of the ghost wolves, a tall, scarred warrior with kind eyes, came to her side. "My Luna," he said, his voice thick with reverence. He offered her a steadying arm, which she gratefully took. The interrogation did not last long. Faced with the certainty of a slow, painful death at the hands of a furious Alpha, the director's will crumbled. He sang, revealing a network of hidden cells and high-value targets that would keep Ryker's forces busy for months. He had thought he was cutting the head off a rival organization. Instead, he had given Ryker the map to burn his entire empire to the ground. When it was over, Ryker made a gesture, and Finn, who had arrived with reinforcements after securing the mine, dragged the broken director away. Justice would be served pack-style. Finally, Ryker turned to Kaela. He crossed the space between them, his face still grim, but the fury in his eyes had been replaced by an overwhelming, fierce pride. He dismissed her escort with a nod and took her arm himself, his touch surprisingly gentle. He said nothing as he led her from the tunnels, through the now waking city, and back to the waiting truck. The silence was not empty. It was filled with everything that had just happened. They had fought together. They had won together. Back in the sanctuary of his suite, as the first rays of dawn painted the sky, he finally spoke. He pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her hair, inhaling her scent as if to reassure himself that she was real and safe. "I have never in my life seen such power wielded with such grace," he murmured against her skin, his voice thick with emotion. "You taught me," she whispered, her hands clinging to his jacket. "No," he corrected, pulling back to look at her, his hands framing her face. "I only showed you the door. You were the one who had the courage to walk through it." The battle had forged them into something new. The last vestiges of their old roles, captor and captive, alpha and outcast, had been burned away in the heat of combat. They were equals, partners, two halves of a whole, bound by fate, sealed by a mark, and now tempered in fire. He leaned down and kissed her, and this kiss was different from all the others. It was not the desperate passion of their first true connection, nor the solemn vow of the marking. This was a kiss of profound respect, of shared victory. It was the kiss of a king and his queen, surveying the dawn of their new reign. Chapter 19, The Scars We Choose. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of calculated, brutal efficiency. Armed with the intelligence from the director, Ryker launched a swift, silent war against the consortium. His ghost wolves, often guided by Kaela's shadow scouting, moved across the continent, dismantling cells, freeing captured supernaturals, and erasing the consortium's influence piece by piece. Kaela never left the pack house, but she was at the very heart of the war. From the safety of the war room, she became Ryker's eyes and ears. She would extend her senses through the shadows, confirming targets, identifying traps, and ensuring his warriors came home safe. She had found her place, not just as a Luna to be protected, but as the pack's shadow intelligence, a vital and respected part of their command structure. The fear that had ruled her life for so long was gone, replaced by a quiet, fierce confidence. She was no longer hiding from her power. She was reveling in it. She walked with her head held high, the quiet girl from the diner a distant memory, a ghost of a life that was no longer hers. Ryker, for his part, was a changed Alpha. The cold, controlled suspicion was gone, replaced by an open, fierce devotion to his mate. They were inseparable, a unit of power and purpose. In the war room they were a commander and his strategist. In the quiet moments in their suite, they were just Vince and Kaela, two scarred souls who had found their other half in the most unlikely of circumstances. One evening they stood on their balcony, looking out at the territory. The war was winding down. The last of the consortium's major cells had been eliminated. A hard-won peace was settling over the land. Ryker came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and pulling her back against his chest. He rested his chin on her shoulder, his warmth a familiar comfort. "It's over," he said, his voice a low rumble against her ear. "For now," she replied, leaning into his embrace. She knew the world was a dangerous place. There would always be other threats. "There will always be threats," he murmured, as if reading her mind. "But they will never find you hiding in a diner again. They will have to come through the gates of my home and face the wrath of my pack. They will have to face us. Together." He turned her in his arms to face him. He gently traced the line of the old scar on her cheek, his touch filled with a familiar reverence. "This was a mark of pain," he said softly. "A scar you were given." Then, he lowered his head and pressed a soft, lingering kiss to the spot on her neck where he had marked her. When he looked up, his silver eyes were blazing with love and possession. "But this one," he growled, "this is a scar you chose. A mark of power, of belonging, of us." Tears of pure, unadulterated happiness welled in her eyes. The scar on her face was from a man who had tried to break her. The mark on her neck was from the man who had helped her become whole. She had spent a lifetime running from what she was, only to find everything she had ever wanted by finally embracing it. Chapter 20, The Beginning. Several months later, the great hall of the packhouse was filled not with the grim tension of war, but with the joyous sounds of celebration. The annual Harvest Moon Festival was in full swing, a time for the pack to give thanks for their prosperity and security. At the head table, on a throne-like chair carved from dark oak, sat Alpha Ryker. But he was not the cold, solitary ruler he had once been. At his side, in a matching chair, sat Luna Kaela. She wore a simple, elegant gown the color of a midnight sky, and she moved with an easy grace and confidence that held the entire room in thrall. Her laughter, a sound rarely heard in the early days, now echoed in the hall as she spoke with the pack elders. The shadows in the room were calm, almost playful, seeming to dance in the corners in time with the music. They were a part of her, and thus a part of the pack's home. Later in the evening, Ryker led her by the hand out to the large balcony overlooking the valley. The full moon, huge and silver, bathed the world in an ethereal light. "A year ago," he said, his voice a low, intimate rumble, "I was a king on a cold throne. I had power. I had respect. But my world was gray. And I was a ghost, hiding in a city of millions, pretending to be someone I wasn't," she added, her voice soft. "My world was a cage of my own making." He turned her to face him, his silver eyes glowing in the moonlight, filled with a love so profound it still sometimes stole her breath. "And now?" She looked around at the strong, vibrant pack that had become her family. She thought of the power that hummed beneath her skin, a familiar and welcome friend. She looked up at the fierce, possessive, and utterly devoted Alpha who was her other half. She rose on her toes and pressed a soft, lingering kiss to his lips. "And now," she whispered against his mouth, "we are home." He pulled her tight against him, her back to the railing, his body a warm, solid shield against the rest of the world. He was her Alpha, her mate, her king. And she was his shadow queen, his partner, his everything. The lie had been her shield. The pretense of weakness had been her survival. But the truth, the dangerous, beautiful, undeniable truth, had been her salvation. Their story had not been one of a human girl captured by a wolf. It had been the story of a hidden queen finding her throne, and a lonely king finally finding his soul. This was not the end of their journey. It was just the beginning.